So, welcome back to the ISSR In Conversation series here on the ISSR YouTube channel. As usual, I'm Anthony Nairn. I'm the Assistant Director of ISSR, and I'm here today with Fraser Watts, who is a colleague, a friend, a boss of sorts, who is Executive Secretary of the International Society for Science and Religion. And I'm excited to have him here because he's long run the operations in the background of the society. And he's probably been in videos that you've seen, but the conversation hasn't ever really been about him. So I wanted to correct that. So, Fraser, welcome. It's good to have you here.
It's a pleasure.
So, I'd like to start the way I always do with just a brief bio rundown, if you will. I know that you started at Oxford. You so kindly organized a stay for me once at your at the college that you were at. But tell us a bit about your background and getting to the point post PhD.
So I was born in the West Midlands in Coventry, just outside Birmingham. Went to school initially in Coventry, then to school in Warwick, minor public school, as we call them in Britain. I went over there on the bus each day. I think I wasn't an easy pupil to teach. And I think in my first 10 years, I think I was struggling in various ways, emotionally and in other ways, and I think that showed in my academic performance. Then, as I got into my secondary school years, I think I got a bit opinionated and eccentric, and was difficult to handle for other reasons. I think the school handled me very well. I congratulate them on that looking back. I think I wasn't easy, but I think they did a good job with me.
Well, that's good. So, okay, so you went there and then some time passes and you end up at Oxford for your undergraduate degree. And what was that in?
That was in psychology and philosophy. It was a degree with three subjects, but you only did two. The other one was physiology. Most people did psychology with either philosophy or physiology. I really went up to Oxford wanting to do philosophy, and rather curiously, Oxford didn't then, this may still be the case, didn't offer a pure degree in philosophy. You had to do philosophy with something else, and you could do philosophy with all sorts of things, an increasing number of things, but I chose to do it with psychology.
And so your intention was to just do philosophy. So what led you into the psychology stream?
Well, I was interested in the human mind. I think philosophy and psychology are both interested in the human mind from different points of view. And I wasn't thinking very clearly in vocational terms, but I already had an idea that I might offer myself to be a priest in the Church of England, and philosophy seemed not a bad preparation for that, if that was where I was going.
Okay. And you did do an MSc, correct? A
Yes, I
master's.
did. So after my first degree in Oxford, I went to London, and I trained in clinical psychology. I mean, at the end of my degree, I thought I was still considering ordination, but decided to postpone it and to do something with my degree. There's not so much you can do with philosophy, but there are more jobs in psychology. So just for that practical reason, I went into some kind of applied psychology. I went to University of London and trained in clinical psychology. It was a very brief training in those days. The psychologists didn't have all that many skills, and it didn't take very long to pick up what there was. So I did. uh, a 13-month training in clinical psychology in the University of London.
The University of London ch has changed since then, or was it part of the conglomerate of different universities at that point?
So I was in, I mean, the University of London is vast. It contains all sorts of things. There's been a policy in recent years to bring it together under five or six conglomerates. But when I was there, they hadn't got very far with that. And I was training at um, what was really a medical school of a psychiatric hospital called the Institute of Psychiatry.
Okay, interesting. And so, okay, so you spent 14 months there, and when that was done, you came out of that with a PhD in clinical psychology.
No, I came out of the training course with an MSc and I went on to do a PhD in the same place. And I started that full time. I was in a fast-growing subject in an era in which universities generally were growing quickly, and I migrated across to being a part-time lecturer about 18 months into my PhD and a full-time lecturer another 6 months after that, and then finished off my PhD in my spare time as best I could.
Okay, so you had the clinical training coming from your master's into your PhD. From your PhD, you were receiving the like pedagogical training and teaching. So you were kind of setting yourself up for an academic career pretty early on in your PhD career, in your PhD degree. So when you graduated with your PhD, where did you go then?
So I stayed on as a lecturer. I mean, my PhD
Okay.
morphed into being a lecturer. So
Okay.
when the PhD was done, I just continued with my day job as a lecturer. It was a funny kind of lectureship. It was partly teaching, but I was also providing clinical services in the hospital, the Maudsley Hospital that the institute was attached to. Then after a few years of that, not so many years, the General Hospital over the road advertised for a head of their clinical psychology department, and I thought that might be fun. There was quite a lot of interest at the time in applying clinical psychology to general medicine, not just to mental health problems. And I thought it would give me an interesting opportunity to develop some of that.
Okay. So what year is this? Just so we have time
Yes.
reference.
So, I mean, my undergraduate degree is 65 to 68. 68 to 75, I'm at the Institute of Psychiatry doing MSc, then a bit of the PhD, becoming a lecturer and finishing off the PhD while I'm doing that. Then 1981, I move over the road to King's College Hospital.
Okay. Okay. And at what point did you become the first Starbridge lecturer at Cambridge? That was in 94.
In between my London clinical psychology jobs and becoming the Starbridge lecturer, I spent about 13 years working for the Medical Research Council in Cambridge, um, doing research on the kind of scientific basis of cognitive therapy. It was already clear that cognitive therapy worked quite well, but we didn't have a very good understanding of why. And I went to work in a prestigious cognitive psychology unit, and the job was to build a team around me and to make some headway in understanding what were the cognitive changes that were going on in cognitive therapy.
Okay. So there's there's something there's something in this period, I'm assuming, that went from what you just described in your clinical psychology and your interests in the human mind as a method of intervention on illness, etc. And what you mentioned earlier of your kind of vague but slightly directed notion of becoming an Anglican priest. So at what do you remember a point in which for you what we term just generally science and religion for just for the sake of ease, those two kind of came into contact?
Hmm. Yes, I think they came into contact partly through a group, a Cambridge-based group known as the Epiphany Philosophers, though I'd had some contact with them even before I moved to Cambridge through an academic friend. Um, they have an unusual approach to science and religion. It was still is a kind of rather alternative science that is not constrained by scientific assumptions and what you might call radical science and a particular kind of religion, contemplative, serious sort of spiritual practice kind of religion, and pretty rigorous professional philosophy, bringing those three things together.
And just for those who don't know, could you give like a 1 minute synopsis of what the Epiphany Philosophers is when they began? They're still going, I believe. But when they began, how often they meet? Just a little, just a brief, very brief little rundown.
Yes, well, I think I've already conveyed the main emphases, really radical science, rigorous philosophy, and contemplative religion. That gave rise to a particular kind of interface between science and religion, and I didn't push that particularly hard when I was teaching science and religion at Cambridge, but I think it's was always congenial to me, always there in my sort of private approach to science and religion.
Right, okay. And but when did the Epiphany Philosophers begin? Sorry.
Oh, they began ages ago. Their opening conference was in 1951 when I was only five.
Okay, okay. So it's been around a while at this point.
And
Okay.
they started a journal in 1966, which was a point where they became a bit more public, and the journal ran for I think just under 20 years. Yeah, and I
Okay.
published in that a bit.
Okay. Okay, so this is kind of this is the first contact point with the science and religion field, if I may. And how long between this contact point and then you beginning at Cambridge as Starbridge lecturer?
Um, well, yes. Probably about 10 years of sort of developing
Okay.
interest in science and religion, during which I published the first book in the field, The Psychology of Religious Knowing, um, with a friend and colleague, Mark Williams. And I think having published that was one of the reasons why Cambridge University took the risk of appointing me as a Starbridge lecturer.
So okay, so this is now 1994. They've taken this risk.
Yes.
Um, can you tell us a little bit about the shape, if I can use that, of science and religion before this? Because having come into this field in the 20, 21st century, my view of it then, like looking at someone like Ian Barbour at Carleton College, it seems very much that it was rooted in cosmology and physics. I believe our the first ISSR president, um, Polkinghorne, he was a cosmologist or a physicist or
Yes.
um,
Yes. Physicist.
so
Yeah.
so if you have kind of this precedent of science and religion being engaged from these kind of these noble sciences, the old and very powerful establishment sciences, and they take a risk on they take a risk, as you said, on you as a clinical psychologist coming at it from a very different angle. What was your view of the field then going into this?
Well, I mean, for quite a while, I didn't really know much about the field, let me be honest. So, I
Okay,
mean,
that's fair.
I was interested in the interface of really cognitive psychology and religion, particularly contemplative religion in an epiphany philosopher kind of way. And I really didn't know much about the field of science and religion at all. I saw an advertisement for this lectureship. By this stage, become an Anglican priest. I was looking for a job in which I could bring my religious and scientific interest together. I saw this advertisement at the last minute in a rather accidental way, and I thought, oh, I'll give it a shot. I'll put an application in. I didn't know much about the science and religion field. When I was shortlisted, I think I had about a fortnight to bone up on the field about science and religion, so I didn't sound completely ignorant at the interview, but I was skating on very thin ice when I was appointed to this post. And why they appointed me, I mean, um, um, John Polkinghorne was on the appointment committee. He's been an influential figure in my life. Um, he was determined that they should appoint a scientist of some kind. He thought otherwise the post just had no credibility, and I was the only scientist of any kind on the shortlist. I was up against a bunch of historians, I understand.
Okay.
And John Polkinghorne was very much for appointing a scientist of some kind rather than a historian. And I mean, my science was a long way from his, but I don't think he minded that at all. I think he rather thought he'd done pretty much everything you could usefully do on the interface of physics and theology at that point. He didn't think there was much left for anyone else to do that he hadn't already done. So I think he was quite interested in appointing someone in a completely different area of science where there hadn't been so much work. And another another member of the appointment panel, Nicholas Lash, theologian, was also quite interested in mind sciences and was, I think, quite well disposed to appointing a psychologist. The third influential person was a philosopher, Mary Hesse, who I knew slightly, and I think from her point of view, having half of my first degree in philosophy was an insurance against the worst kind of philosophical stupidities.
Interesting. So it sounds like Polkinghorne was thinking about this posting strategically in that, I mean, maybe he didn't think that physics, cosmology, and religion had reached its end point, but he felt that maybe he had said all that he wanted to say, but he saw that there was room for the science of science and religion to expand into new areas. So it was a very strategic appointment then, it sounds like.
Yeah,
Um,
yes, yes, it was. And there was his absolute determination to appoint a scientist.
Interesting. Okay. So you were in that for about 19 years, I guess, right?
Yes, little bit less. I think it was about another 13 years again. Yeah.
Okay.
No, no,
So,
no, sorry. No, you're right. It was 19 years, 19 knocking on 20.
yeah, okay. So over that period of time, I mean, if there's anything that you would like to get into during your time there, you're more than welcome to. But during that period, what did you notice happen in the field of science and religion? Because during this time, our society was formed, ISSR was formed. in the wake of the 9/11 incident in New York. So I imagine that there was so much happening, but what stands out for you in our field during that time?
Hmm. I don't think I was sort of watching the field all that closely in this period. I was horrendously busy. It was a furiously busy 20 years, hardly time to sort of sleep and breathe. I mean, it was all great fun, but I was very busy. Amongst other things, John Polkinghorne dragged me into being the first secretary of ISSR, which was not something I particularly wanted to do, but he pressed me quite hard, and I didn't feel I could say no. So that was, but I don't think I was really paying all that much attention to ISSR. Um, I was in the strange position of appointed to lecture on science and religion where I knew very little about the field, really. I'd had my fortnight before the interview of frantic up on it, but then I was appointed to a lectureship, and immediately I had to start lecturing on science and religion. And in my first term as a lecturer, I was giving 2 lectures a week, and I mean, so 2 or 3 days to prepare each lecture, and I had to sort of do the basic reading and gather my thoughts and put it together into some kind of a lecture twice a week. It was a very pressured introduction to lecturing about science and religion.
Okay. So you were extremely busy. Not you were part of the field, but you weren't at the level of you weren't at the level in which you could see how the field was shaping at that time, which is completely fair. I mean, I imagine that the job was quite demanding. So, um,
I was also running an Anglican church in my spare time.
of course, yes. So it's like two full-time jobs.
Yeah.
Um,
And
so so
and and at Cambridge, I mean, the university basically employs you full time as a lecturer, and then most lecturers get into a spare time job as a college fellow, sort of looking after the students in their particular college who were doing their subject. So I had a full time job and 2 spare time jobs, one as a college fellow, one as a priest in the church.
right, and just for everyone listening, that was Queen's College, correct?
Yes, yes. Um, where John Polkinghorne was president. I
Okay.
mean, it was partly an accident that a vacancy came up there at the time when I was looking for one, but it helped that he'd already largely appointed me to the university post, and he hadn't yet decided he'd made a mistake, so he was open to appointing me to his college as well.
So forgive my ignorance, but perhaps you can help me understand this and maybe others as well, because we don't have, well, here in Canada we have University of Toronto, which is kind of similar, but not really reaching the same same level of college affiliation. So when you're appointed to a college, what does that grant you versus your appointment at a department at the university? What um what levels of association do different departments have with different colleges, or is it completely just whoever has a post available?
So most colleges teach most subjects, so they have a fellow
Okay.
in most subjects. And one of the nice things about being in a college in Cambridge or Oxford is that you're mixing quite closely with people in other subjects. And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
In most universities, you don't see very much of colleagues in outside your own department. In Oxford and Cambridge, you do. Most days, you're having lunch with someone in a completely different subject.
Yeah, that sounds really nice.
And it brings you various sort of privileges like a car parking space and a place to have meals and an office. It comes with some administrative responsibilities and teaching responsibilities. And but on the whole, I felt that was a good deal.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah,
And
interesting.
I mean, one of the things I was learning at this stage was how to supervise a humanities PhD. I mean, I'd done a scientific PhD and I'd supervised quite a few of those, but a humanities PhD in which you don't sort of collect any data seemed to a very strange animal. And it took me a little while to sort of work out what a humanities PhD was or could be. And I remember having some useful conversations with um, colleagues in other disciplines in the college about that, particularly one historian, a historian of medieval economic history, which is quite a specialist field. And he said rather grandly over lunch, there are only two things you can do for a PhD, either something no one has done before or something someone's tried and got wrong.
Okay, yes. Well, as someone with a PhD in the humanities, I think I agree with that. I yeah, it's a very different beast, I imagine. Yes, I'll leave it at that. We could get into that maybe later. So, okay. So your time at Cambridge was busy, fruitful, I'm sure. Sounds like it at least.
I mean,
And
I was fairly successful in getting research grant income. Um, That partly came through John Polkinghorne again, who played a very helpful role in my career. He won the Templeton Prize, and that came with a whole lot of prize money, and also the guy running JTF at that time wanted to give him a large research grant. John Polkinghorne was didn't really want a large research grant at that point in his life, and he suggested that he and I had the research grant jointly, which JTF went
well,
with. And then he took an interest in what I was doing with the research grant, but he really wanted to leave it to me to make good use of the considerable amount of grant money that came my way through that rather unusual route.
interesting. Wow. Okay. So this was a very fortunate relationship.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay.
So I built up and was able to sort of hire and employ quite a large research group, working particularly in my area of science of religion. We called ourselves the Psychology and Religion Research Group. So quite a lot of my time and energy went into managing that. That was another significant job.
Okay. And and I'm assuming that given these large grants and the amount of time you spent at Cambridge, you had a number of publications, including some books. Um, Reflecting back on those works, which ones stand out to you as probably having the greatest impact or being the most personally meaningful?
Yes. I think my academic work improved quite a bit in my 20 years in Cambridge, and probably if I'd been less busy, it could have improved sooner. But I think I was doing better work in my last 5 years there than I had earlier on. Um, a number of my books were books that I edited and in which I contributed quite a lot of stuff myself. I did that in my Cambridge years more than writing solo books. I think I only wrote one book on my own in my Cambridge years, but there were quite a lot of edited books. There was and some of those were sort of on the way out, sort of almost finished when I completed my time in Cambridge and came to retirement. There was a book on spiritual healing towards the end, which I put quite a lot of time and effort into, and another book on head and heart, dual modes of cognition, which has been an enduring theme in quite a lot of my work on science and religion for the last 10, 15 years.
My first my first encounter with you, not in person, but in reading, was in the Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion. You have a chapter in there. I think that was edited by Peter Harrison, and you had a chapter in there, and I thought it was really interesting because you spent some time on spirituality in that chapter, and you spent a a number of articles and a number of your work you spent time on spirituality, and I'd like to get back to that a little bit later, but I just want to finish this bio. So you left Cambridge in like 2013, and at that point it was pretty shortly after that you joined ISSR, I believe, correct?
No, I was already in ISSR. I was the founding secretary of ISSR in 2002.
Oh, I thought that you as executive secretary was post.
It was. So, I mean, executive secretary was a later term, but I was the founding secretary of ISSR in 2002. I mean, I didn't have
Yes.
time to do much. I tried to delegate most of what
Yeah.
needed to be done, but I've been involved in ISSR all the way through. But
Yes. No, I do know you're a founding I do know you're a founding member, just to clear that. But you did mention earlier that you were so busy you weren't really
yeah.
active in the society so much. But I'm wondering when your
Mm.
activity in it became more akin to what it is now.
So just before I retired from Cambridge, I had a brief period as president of ISSR, but only a brief period. Then I passed that baton on to Michael Rice, and shortly after that, I became executive secretary. And Michael and I had quite a long, fruitful collaboration. Um, um, in ISSR, and I like to think it was a period in which ISSR really came to life.
Yeah, so my just to hog the time here for a moment. My first encounter with ISSR was when Michael Rice and yourself um, approved my paper to speak at Oxford. Oxford. That was for the Social Brain Project, I believe, at St. Anne's in 2017. And yeah, it seems like a very alive and prosperous society then.
Yeah. So ISSR always had funding issues. I mean, just to divert on onto that for a moment, and as executive secretary, I've always seen it as my responsibility more than anyone else to try and sort of keep ISSR afloat financially. In the early years, JTF gave us large sums of money at the behest of Sir John, um, just for being ISSR and to get off the ground. But that money obviously didn't last forever. Then we had a conversation with JTF about our future, and the pitch at that time was that we could have more JTF money, but we had to compete for it with other people for particular projects. The first big project before my time was a library project that Pranab Das managed. He secured that grant.
Right,
But
right.
then after my retirement, when I became executive secretary, I managed to get from one or other Templeton Foundation a series of four reasonably large grants, which have kept ISSR going and which has enabled us to do some really interesting research. One was on a new, more systemic, holistic biology, then the social brain project that you've mentioned, then a project on spiritual intelligence, bringing together religion and AI, and currently a more empirical research project on the science of spiritual practices.
Yeah, it's been a very fruitful research track that you've led ISSR on. Um, yeah, the society certainly owes a great deal to the work that you've done on that front. And it's also really helped. I mean, this is a little bit of like, yay us, but it's really helped us, I think, make a an impact on not only the field but also the perception of ISSR. Our fellows have grown immensely over the past few years, which has been really great. So yeah, ISSR is certainly in a great place now. So that I think is a pretty rough sketch of your biography. Is there anything else that you think we missed there? I think we kind
No,
of
I think that's enough. Yeah.
yeah, okay, great. So with that said, now I would like you to think about science and religion as a field from the time that you were becoming involved with it as something that you are aware of more and more to the present. And I would like you to reflect on those changes, where you see the most change, where you see the least change, the directions it's taking, and maybe areas that you think are in need of more questions being asked.
So it certainly has changed. I think when ISSR was founded, the main emphasis was still on arguing that there was no incompatibility between science and religion. I think we were still sort of dominated by the conflict model. It was even in religious terms even more dominated by Christianity than it is now, and in scientific terms, mainly dominated by physics, cosmology, and evolutionary biology. So it's broadened, I think, in various ways. It's broadened in multi-faith terms. It's broadened in the sciences it engaged with. I think in the early days we didn't consider engaging with environmental science or artificial intelligence or various other disciplines that have become quite important. And we've moved on from the conflict model. And I think there's a generational aspect to that. I think younger people in science and religion have grown more impatient with the conflict model. One of the things that's replaced it is an emphasis on human flourishing. How can science and religion collaborate to promote human flourishing and make the world a better place? Um, and that I think was a feature of the ISSR Ecology Environment Conference, really. How can there be a fruitful collaboration between science and religion in facing the environmental crisis we have? So there was um, other kinds of broadening as well. Um, the the concept of religion, I think I've become increasingly aware, is a bit parochial. I've been quite interested in India over the last year or two and have put quite a bit of time and effort into um, developing ISSR in India. And the concept of religion doesn't really work in India. We need some alternative concept like ancient wisdom traditions or something like that. Um, um, the the Epiphany philosophers have continued to interest me and shape my interest. Um, one of the things coming out of that is an interest in a sort of mutual influence between science and religion, not just religion adapting to the scientific facts of life, but religion pitching in and shaping the way science goes. Various people in the field have also been interested in that. And two people I think of particularly are Bob Russell and Sarah Coakley, but I've also been interested in that. And I think there's more scope for that in psychology than there is in some other disciplines. I think religion can have a useful influence on psychology more than it can perhaps on cosmology. And it was you mentioned the chapter I wrote for Peter Harrison's handbook, and it was one of the conversations we had, Peter and I, as I was working on that chapter, that it's a feature of the relationship between psychology and religion that there is more mutual influence than there can be with some other sciences.
Mm.
So that's quite a long answer, but various ways in which I see the field broadening.
Yeah, great. And you're mentioning a younger generation of scholars in this field, and when I think of who's kind of leading the charge on that, I think of the International Research Network on Science and Belief in Society, which unfortunately ran out of funding recently. But that kind of what you said really kind of sums up what they were about, and in some ways are still about, though it's hard to do things without money. Um, the I guess one of the questions I have for you is related to what you said was how well Peter Harrison's books, some new world, is I think kind of probes a little bit at that question of religion influencing science, within the respect of the two terms natural and supernatural. Um, but I wonder what your view is as someone who has both been um, um, a long practicing scientist of the mind. There may be some philosophers of science who may have some problem with that, um, just because of the replication crisis and all those fun things. But let's put that aside. A scientist of the mind, and also a at one point a practicing, um, ordained priest in the Anglican Church in Cambridge. I'm wondering if your own experience of the conflict, thesis has come up, because it isn't something that doesn't exist. It does exist,
Mm, mm.
and it has some significant staying power. And I'm wondering if you could be a little self-reflective, and also maybe a little self-critical, and think about why that is, because I feel like someone like you probably has more purchase on this question um than others.
Yes. I mean, there is a particular history of the
Of course.
conflict model, and it's a child of its time. It really comes from the latter part of the 19th century. And it's an interesting question, quite what it was about the latter part of the 19th century that gave rise to the conflict model. Um, For me, I mean, history of science and religion is not been a major preoccupation, but it is. But I think the late 19th century is, for me, much the most fascinating period. Exactly what was going on there, what was shifting, why things were shifting around. And when I was sort of doing my 101 science and religion course, and including a bit of history, the 19th century was always the one that interested me most. Um, but I don't want to get too deeply into that. Something's on my mind. I think I'd like to say. I think it bears roughly on this. Is that in part of the shift in science and religion, we've moved away from sort of clearing away the idea that there's conflict, showing that they're trying to show there isn't conflict, to trying to show that there can be a really fruitful, positive relationship between science and religion. That
Mm.
at least one of them, I would say both of them, are better for being in dialogue with the other than they would be on their own. And fleshing that out and providing good examples of sort of fruitful cross-fertilization seems to me the most fruitful way to tackle the conflict model. To shift from arguing against the negative or arguing for the positive.
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting reframe. Rather than thinking about conflict as being destructive and having these negative outcomes, thinking about conflict as being constructive and having positive
Yeah.
outcomes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's it. That's actually a really good way to good way to put it. Um, Another question I have is is about spirituality, which I mentioned earlier. So and I think this relates to what you said earlier regarding like wisdom traditions. So I'm wondering, these are terms that don't really have much strength yet, but I do think that there's something to be said about this. So you were talking about India, and India is a great example. Like for example, like British colonialism is essentially one of the creators of religion as a categorization and statistical tool for for purposes of empire in India. Um, but so religion itself is problematic. And you mentioned these wisdom traditions, but spirituality too also has a place to play, but doesn't really have much strength, I think, in terms of discussions in science and religion, or as much as it should. So I was wondering if you could just roughly um, discuss how you view this term wisdom tradition and like is this the one that you're sold on? Like is this the term that you're trying to use and move with, or is there something else you're brewing? Because this is something that I've been thinking about is what is a more apt title? Like, should it be the International Society for Sciences and Religions and Spiritual Practices or something? Like,
Yes.
how do we bring that so it's tighter and more descriptive?
Yeah. Um, I think religion is a more problematic term than science. I mean, science is a term with some problems, but religion is a very problematic term. And I take religion in the context of ISSR as a shorthand for um, religion and spirituality and wisdom traditions. So
Mhm.
I wouldn't want a narrow interpretation of what we mean by religion. I mean, the concept of religion itself has an interesting history, and in the way we use the term now, it's largely a product of um, developing secularization and atheism. I mean, it's only when people are starting to assert that they're not religious that religion takes on the kind of meaning that it has now. If you go back to much earlier generations, Aquinas or Calvin, it means something completely different. It's your kind of rule of life, your religion. There's no contrast between religion and non-religion of the kind we have now. It's a very complicated term.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very loaded. Yeah. Uh, So, yeah. So a very complicated term that we probably can't get to any kind of conclusion on in a short discussion, but definitely something to keep working on, I think. Um, a personal question regarding science and religion for you. How has your own your own scientific background and your own theological and priestly background, how have these two shaped your thinking? How have these two motivated your stance towards not only the fields but the world more generally?
I mean, they have both been very influential. I mean, I'm deeply rooted in spirituality and my own Christian faith tradition. Um, I've also been some kind of scientist for a long time now, really since my Oxford undergraduate days, 1965. So I've got a long and deep investment in both. Increasingly, my understanding of the issue issues that arise in bringing them together arise from cognitive psychology. As I've mentioned already, I've been increasingly interested in dual cognition models in psychology. And I think science is using one mode of cognition, and religion, spirituality, wisdom traditions are using predominantly another mode of cognition. So it's not just that there's a discrepancy over content, there's a completely different way of thinking. And um, people talk about dual modes of cognition in different terminology, but Ian McGilchrist's terminology of left brain, right brain is one way of talking about this. Head and heart is another. And I think McGilchrist's terminology has quite good traction in whatever view people have about the neurological basis of those two modes of cognition.
Yeah, obviously one very quick and um yeah, one very quick and rapid critique of that dual hemisphere cognition is that people have looked at the brain and they see that kind of various areas are lighting up during certain tasks.
Right.
But my understanding is that he's not actually talking about hemispheres in that way. This is more of an analogy or a metaphor um, for cognitions that operate on different levels, not an actual cognitive neurofiring map, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of people do take the terms metaphorically, and that's fine if people want to take them in that way. But actually, if you come to the scientific evidence, you've got two main bodies of evidence. One looking at the effects of brain damage in people who've had serious damage to one hemisphere or the other. And it seems to me fairly clear and beyond dispute that it makes a big difference which hemisphere you've got damage to. And
Okay.
Ian McGilchrist sets out that evidence at great length in chapter 2 of The Master and His Emissary, and I think that's basically sound. If you use a scanning methodology, give people tasks and see which areas of the brain are lighting up, you get a more complex, subtle picture, but maybe that's asking a different question.
Okay, interesting. As kind of like a final question, what has the field of science and religion given to you that you would wish to depart on to someone else?
I suppose the main thing is just that both are important. They've been important in my life, and I think it's right for them both to be important. So that's really the most important thing, to keep them both in play. I think not to narrow down and to rely on just one or the other. Um, and as I've said, I think they use different modes of cognition. And to make the point more generally, I think it's really important in human life to be making use of both modes of cognition, the intuitive embodied mode of cognition and the more rational analytical mode of cognition. And science and religion is one way of bringing those two things together, probably one of the best developed ways of bringing those two modes of cognition together.
Anything else that you would like to state?
Just one thought left hanging from ways in which science and religion has changed. I think
Yes.
science and religion's always had mediating disciplines, and I think that's been helpful. And when ISSR was founded, I think it was history and philosophy. And I think the range of mediating disciplines that give you a perspective on both science and religion and the relationship between them, has been broadening. And I would certainly now want to put social cultural science in there. And increasingly, as I've been saying, put cognitive science in there as well. Because I think science and religion are using different modes of cognition. And I think cognitive science, cognitive psychology give you a very helpful perspective on that. So I think that's an important way in which the field has been enriched recently.
Yeah, okay. And definitely something for future scholars, those in school right now to maybe pursue. Um,
Mm,
well, Fraser, thank you so much for taking the time to just talk about yourself
mm,
for
yeah.
an hour. It was really nice to hear, and it was really interesting to hear how not only the field has changed, but also your entry point into it, which I think is unusual in some ways. I think, I mean, you might have a different thought on this, but my understanding or my view of it is that you kind of set the precedent for psychology as an entry point for science and religion discussions. So you helped out many to come later. Like for example, in the INSBS, the International Research Network on Science and Beliefs in Society, there's a lot of young psychologists now. And it's a pretty interesting development, and some of our newer fellows also reflect that. So yeah, it's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Anthony.